Growing up, Christmas was always my favorite time of year. As a kid, it's hard not to be enchanted by the magic of the season, presents stacked under the tree, the twinkle of holiday lights, and the sense of excitement that fills the air. There's something indescribable about that joy. It's the one time of year, besides your birthday, where the world feels a little brighter, a little warmer, and a little more special. I was like most children, eagerly counting down the days until Christmas morning, knowing I'd wake up to a pile of gifts and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. But not every Christmas brings joy. In fact, one particular Christmas Eve is forever etched in my memory, not because of presents, or family, or holiday cheer, but because of an encounter with something far darker. This happened in 2009, in upstate New York. I was 16 years old at the time, and winter break had started off slow and uneventful. The snow outside had piled up in thick layers, coating everything in a blanket of white. As the holiday season droned on, I spent most of my time in my room, playing Modern Warfare 2 on my Xbox 360. My friends and I would stay up late into the night, cursing and laughing over our headsets as we battled our way through endless domination matches. It was Christmas Eve, and my family and I had just returned home from a gathering at my grandma's house. We'd eaten, laughed, and shared stories, but by the time we returned home, my parents were exhausted. They'd been planning to stay up for a while, but after the long day, they both passed out almost immediately. I, however, wasn't about to call it a night. Christmas morning was still hours away, and I couldn't contain my excitement. But as my parents insisted we wait for the official holiday to open presents, I had no choice but to entertain myself. So, I turned on the Xbox, slouched into the couch, and got lost in another marathon gaming session. The house was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the heater and the low noise of the game in the background. Our living room was cozy, with the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner, surrounded by a circle of presents. The soft lights from the tree reflected off the windows, casting long shadows around the room, creating a surreal atmosphere that was perfect for late-night gaming. As the night dragged on, I lost track of time. The hours slipped by until I glanced at the clock and realized it was already 4 a.m. A strange drowsiness settled over me, and despite the excitement of Christmas Eve, my eyelids grew heavy. My head nodded off, and I drifted into a light sleep on the couch. It was then that I heard something. At first, it was barely perceptible, like the faint scraping of a branch against a window. But then it grew louder. I sat up quickly, my heart beating faster. What was that? I froze, listening closely. The sound was now unmistakable, something, or someone, was scratching at the window. Then, I heard the crunching of snow under heavy boots. The noise came from outside, just beyond the window. I was now wide awake. My mind raced, but I tried to stay calm. Could it have been an animal? Or a prankster in the middle of the night? I hesitated, but then, with slow, deliberate steps, I made my way toward the window. I peered out into the snow-covered front yard, straining to see anything in the dim light. The yard was empty. Not a single sign of movement. I saw nothing except for the faint glow from our porch light reflecting off the snow. I let out a sigh of relief, telling myself I was just being paranoid, maybe a bit too tired from staying up late. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I heard the distinct sound of the back door to the kitchen sliding open. My stomach flipped. The back door was supposed to be locked, and my parents were asleep. There was no way they could have gotten up and gone outside without me hearing them. My heart began to pound in my chest as the sound of footsteps echoed from the kitchen. I felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity grip me. What was going on? Who was in the house? I didn't want to panic, so I cautiously crept toward the top of the stairs. From there I could hear everything more clearly. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, coming closer to the living room. My hand trembled as I gripped the railing, moving down one step at a time. My mind screamed at me to go back to my room and lock the door, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the strange, unsettling feeling creeping over me. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dim light of the Christmas tree, I saw a figure, a man crouched next to the tree. At first, I thought it was just another weird trick of the shadows, but as my eyes focused, the reality of what I was seeing hit me. The man was wearing a ski mask, and in his hand he gripped a large hunting knife. A wave of terror washed over me. I couldn't breathe. He was staring at the tree, as if he didn't even notice me standing there. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. The glow from the tree lights painted his features in a sickly, unsettling light. I must have made some noise, or maybe he just sensed me, but suddenly he looked up. His eyes locked onto mine with a gaze that felt like ice. His face was partially obscured by the mask, but those eyes, those cold, empty eyes, stared directly into me, like a predator spotting its prey. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Neither of us moved, as if we were both calculating our next move. My heart raced in my chest, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. The world outside seemed so far away, and all I could focus on was the man standing in my living room, holding a knife and staring at me. Then, without warning, he straightened up. His movements were fast and jagged, like he had been waiting for this moment. Before I even had time to react, he began to move toward me. The footsteps were silent, but I could hear the heavy breathing beneath the mask, the cold air surrounding us amplifying the moment. I spun around and ran up the stairs, almost tripping over myself in my frantic panic. My breath was ragged, and my mind screamed at me to get to my parents' room. I heard the man's footsteps close behind me. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed my parents' bedroom door shut. "Mom, Dad, wake up," I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. "There's someone in the house. He's got a knife." My dad, jolted awake, didn't hesitate for a second. He reached under the bed, grabbed the shotgun he kept for protection, and stood up. "Stay here," he ordered in a low, calm voice. "Lock the door, and don't open it for anyone." I didn't need to be told twice. My mom grabbed the phone and dialed 911. From behind the door, we heard the man's footsteps again, closer this time. And then, the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. It wasn't locked. In one swift motion, my dad fired the shotgun. The blast echoed through the house, but the man dodged the shot. He quickly darted away from the door, and in that instant, I heard the sound of him running down the stairs. My dad followed, yelling as he chased him into the backyard. I couldn't see them from the window, but the police arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the night. The man was caught a few blocks away, trying to break into another house. Later, the police revealed the truth about the intruder. He had been stalking the neighborhood for days. He'd been in and out of jail multiple times, and this time, he planned to rob us. But he had been so desperate, so brazen, that he didn't even wait for the house to be empty. We learned that the man had come in through the unlocked sliding door in the kitchen, a mistake we would never make again. That night, my family was shaken but safe. We spent the rest of Christmas in front of the TV, watching movies and trying to distract ourselves with comfort food. But as I looked at the Christmas tree, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real Grinch didn't just want to steal presents. He wanted something much darker. The final months of 2018 were exhausting. I felt drained emotionally, physically, and financially. The hardest part had been moving my father into an aged care facility due to his rapidly progressing dementia. My family was spread across Australia, living in Brisbane, while my father was in Tasmania, where I had grown up. The distance between us added to the strain. Every few weeks, I would fly down to Tasmania to sort out the logistics of my dad's situation, often staying for a few days to tackle the overwhelming task of emptying out his house, getting it ready to sell, and fixing whatever was broken. It had become routine, but one thing I could never shake was how unsettling his old house felt. Nestled on a quiet road in a semi-rural area, the house was old, worn, and surrounded by a forest of overgrown trees and thick underbrush. The wooden floors groaned with every step. The walls were damp, and the rooms had an oppressive, dusty atmosphere. The house was virtually empty now, save for a few remnants of my dad's life. There was no electricity, the plumbing was faulty, and the house felt as though it was slowly deteriorating, with each passing day a reminder of how much it had been abandoned. It was late on Christmas Eve when I landed in Tasmania. I had planned to spend the night working at my dad's house, clearing more things out and preparing for the next step in the process. After grabbing my rental car, I stopped by a friend's place for a few drinks, intending to ease the weight of the day. But as the evening wore on, I realized I had probably consumed more than I should have. My friend's wife kindly offered to take me to my dad's house so I could sleep there and get my car in the morning. I didn't realize just how eerie the house would feel in the dead of night. When I arrived around midnight, the house was cloaked in darkness. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees, a sharp contrast to the unnatural stillness inside. I stepped through the front door and into the silence, only the faint glow of my phone's flashlight to guide me. The air felt thick, cold, and stagnant. I walked through the empty rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. It felt as though the house itself had become a character. Watching, waiting, aware of my every movement. I'd been here countless times, but tonight it felt different. It didn't help that I discovered some tools I had left out were missing. A hammer, a wrench, a screwdriver all gone. I briefly thought it was probably some local kids who had noticed the house had been empty and decided to take advantage. Still, there was something about the whole situation that made my skin crawl. The fact that I hadn't locked the house properly made me uneasy. The doors could easily be popped open with a little force, and the house had no security system. I made my way to one of the rooms and spread blankets and pillows on the floor, attempting to settle in for the night. The house creaked around me, the walls groaning with age, and outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the overgrown trees. It was a comforting sound, but tonight it felt more like a warning. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt a nagging unease, as though I wasn't alone. The wind continued to whistle through the trees, but then something else caught my attention. The unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound grew louder, moving closer to the house. My heart began to race. Who could it be? I was miles away from any neighbors, and the house was situated in a secluded area. Then there was a sharp clang, something metallic hitting the metal railing of the back steps. My stomach dropped. It sounded too deliberate, too planned. I froze, straining my ears. The crunch of gravel stopped, but the sense of someone or something being out there only grew stronger. I could hear something or someone moving outside. My breath caught in my throat. My phone was still in my hand. I needed to call the police. But the creeping thought that I might not be alone in the house yet made it hard to move. A sudden, jarring creak came from the back door. Someone was inside. The door had been left ajar, and now it had been pushed open with a loud groan. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I remained as still as possible, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, creaking across the wooden floorboards. The footsteps moved through the house, passing by the room where I was hiding. I could hear whispers, low, urgent whispers coming from the hallway. They were speaking too quietly for me to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a sharp, hushed sound, like someone trying to be covert. "They're here," one of them muttered, barely audible. "Hurry up." I clutched my phone and dialed the police, trying to keep my voice calm, but it was impossible to hide the tension in my voice. The dispatcher answered immediately, and I whispered my location, describing the situation as best I could without drawing attention to myself. The footsteps had moved closer, now to the laundry room. I heard the sound of the toolbox being jostled. The lock was being tampered with, someone trying to force it open. A low, muffled curse came from the other side of the house. Whoever it was knew exactly what they wanted. They had come for the tools. The police dispatcher told me to lock myself in the room and stay quiet. My hands were shaking, but I moved cautiously, making sure to avoid the loud creaks of the floorboards. I reached the door and slowly, silently, latched it shut. Then came the worst moment. The floorboard beneath me creaked loudly. The noise echoed in the hallway, and everything went dead silent. The whispers stopped. The footsteps ceased. I held my breath, waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the stillness in the house seemed to stretch on for what felt like forever. Was I safe? Had they heard me? Then I heard the back door open again, slowly, quietly, and then shut with a soft click. They were gone. I stayed in the room, motionless, for several more minutes. When I finally felt sure enough that they had left, I locked the door and told the dispatcher that I thought they were gone. The dispatcher reassured me, saying the police were on their way. The minutes felt like hours. I waited in the silence, listening for any sign that they might return. When the police arrived, they quickly searched the area, but found nothing. No footprints, no evidence of forced entry, no sign of the intruders. They looked over the toolbox still intact, though the lock was clearly damaged. Why didn't they just use bolt cutters? One officer remarked with a laugh. But I wasn't laughing. I knew the truth. These weren't random thieves. These were people who had been watching the house. They knew exactly what they were after. The officers theorized that the intruders had come earlier in the night, taken what they could, and then returned to get the locked toolbox. It all made sense, but the unsettling feeling I had lingered. I stayed up until dawn, too restless to sleep. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, I decided to get a few hours of sleep before my friend's wife returned to pick me up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed deeper that day, and the house felt colder than it ever had before. Every creak, every whisper of the wind, felt like something was lurking, waiting. Before I left, I made sure to secure every door and window. I bought heavy-duty locks and a security system the next day. I wasn't going to take any chances again. The house may have been empty, but I was certain of one thing: it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It's hard to believe how quickly this year passed. Looking back, it feels like it was all just a blur, like a bad dream I haven't been able to shake. Yet, here we are, somehow still standing. As Christmas approaches, I can't help but reflect on a story from a few years ago, one that still gives me chills. I'd like to share it with you the night I came face to face with a real-life Grinch. This took place when I was 30, married with 2 kids, one 7 and the other 5. I worked as a security guard at a refinery, and let me tell you, during the holiday season, it was nothing short of grueling. I was pulling 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, just to keep the place running smoothly. It was tough, especially because it meant being away from my family for most of the season. But there was one perk: I was guaranteed Christmas Day with my family. That's what kept me going. Christmas Eve was another story, though. I'd begged my boss for the night off, but the schedule was tight. They needed me, and I was stuck working. It stung, but on the bright side, the paycheck would make up for it. After the long shift, I finally got off work at 11 p.m. Christmas Eve. The cold night air hit me as I stepped outside. The chill crawled under my jacket, biting into my skin, but I was used to it. I called my wife from the parking lot, asking if the kids were already in bed. I had all their presents stashed in the trunk of my car, hidden away to keep them from snooping. My wife told me the kids had been asleep for a while, and she was sitting in the bedroom watching TV. When I pulled into the driveway, a little after 11:30, it started to rain. The gentle pitter-patter of the raindrops was soothing, but the quiet of the neighborhood felt eerie, almost too quiet. The streetlights cast long shadows on the wet pavement, and the sound of crickets chirping in the distance added an unsettling, lonely touch. It was the kind of night that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up without you even knowing why. I entered the house, and my wife greeted me with a warm hug and a kiss on the cheek. She handed me a steaming cup of hot cocoa. I could smell the sweetness of it, the comforting warmth that instantly relaxed me. After a long day, it was the perfect thing to ease me into the holiday spirit. I changed into my pajamas, feeling the weight of the hours at the refinery slip away. But just before I could settle down, I remembered the gifts. I grabbed my umbrella and headed out to the car, eager to get everything inside and under the tree before the kids woke up. The rain was still coming down lightly, and the sound of it hitting the leaves in the trees above was almost hypnotic. I retrieved the first gift from the trunk, a Nintendo 64, which I knew my boys had been begging for ever since we visited Santa at the mall. After placing it under the tree, I stood up, stretching my sore back. The hours spent sitting at my desk had taken their toll, but it was the least of my concerns. That's when the strange feeling hit me. A sudden, uncomfortable pressure in my stomach. I had to use the bathroom, badly. I hurried upstairs to the restroom. The downstairs bathroom had been out of commission for a few days, and the upstairs one was the only option. My heart was pounding as I rushed toward it, not thinking much of it. The weight of the day was starting to catch up to me. But when I finished, something felt off. I didn't know why at first, but a cold shiver ran down my spine as I left the bathroom. Something wasn't right. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The living room was visible from the top of the stairs, and from where I stood, I could see everything below. The soft glow of the Christmas tree lights filled the room, casting eerie shadows across the space. But it wasn't the lights that made my heart race. It was the figure in the living room. I squinted, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and my breath hitched in my throat. There, standing in front of the tree, was a man. A tall, heavy-set figure, rummaging through the presents with a large, dark bag slung over his shoulder. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't my wife, nor was it anyone I knew. The figure's movements were jerky and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. His hands moved quickly, tossing the gifts into the bag without even pausing to admire them. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain still. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't grab the shotgun until I knew the situation was more serious. I crept toward the kids' room, hoping to find my wife and make sure she was safe. I found her sitting next to a lamp in the kids' room, quietly reading a book. She looked up and immediately noticed the concern written across my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft, innocent. "Lock the door," I whispered urgently, my heart hammering. "Do it now. Don't ask questions." She blinked in confusion but must have seen something in my eyes, something that told her this wasn't a drill. Without a word, she stood up and quickly locked the door behind her. I didn't have time to explain. I darted into our bedroom, grabbed the shotgun from under the bed, and took a deep breath. My fingers tightened around the cold steel, the weight of it steadying my nerves, even as fear gnawed at the edges of my mind. I headed back to the stairs, careful not to make a sound. But as I approached, I could hear movement. The man was still in the living room, oblivious to the fact that he was no longer alone. I reached the top of the stairs and peeked over the railing. The figure was still there, but now he was heading toward the stairs, looking up at me with wide, unblinking eyes. It was him. The man. I could see his face more clearly now. He was in his mid-40s, with greasy, unkempt hair and a scruffy beard that gave him a wild look. His clothes were torn, as if he had been wearing them for days, or maybe weeks. And in his hand he gripped a large knife, the blade gleaming under the dim light of the Christmas tree. I felt my blood run cold. I didn't hesitate. "Get out of my house. Now!" I shouted, my voice shaking but firm. The man froze, his eyes widening in fear. For a moment he just stood there, staring at me, as if unsure what to do. Then, without another word, he bolted down the stairs, tripping over his own feet as he scrambled toward the front door. I rushed after him, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I heard him crash into the door as he yanked it open and disappeared into the night. I followed him outside, keeping my distance, I watched as he stumbled into the shadows, disappearing into the alleyway like a ghost. Shaking, I quickly locked the door behind me and bolted the windows. My hands were still trembling as I called 911. "Someone broke in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A man. He was trying to steal the gifts, but I scared him off." The operator assured me that help was on the way. Meanwhile, my wife and kids were huddled in the kids' room, their faces pale and anxious. My heart softened seeing them, but the terror of the night still clung to me. I tried to reassure them, especially my kids. "It was the Grinch," I said, offering a weak smile. "He tried to steal your presents, but I scared him off. He went back to his village." My kids giggled, but my wife's expression was grave. She asked how he got inside, and I knew. I had been so caught up in everything grabbing the gifts, using the bathroom, that I'd left the front door wide open. It hit me then this man must have been watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to break in. He was patient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a sign of weakness, and I had given him that opportunity. But he picked the wrong house. He may have gotten away that night, but he never came back. The Christmas was one I'll never forget. The Christmas I stopped the Grinch from stealing my family's joy. We moved to a new home years later, and life returned to its peaceful rhythm. But every year, as Christmas draws near, I think back to that night, to the man in the living room, the one who thought he could ruin our holiday. He never did. And if he had ever thought about returning, well, he never did. It was either 2007 or 2008, I can't recall the exact year, but I do remember the bitter cold and the heavy snow. It was just a few days before Christmas, and I was on a road trip to visit my family. The long stretch of highway seemed endless, and the snowstorm made every mile feel like an eternity. My old Dodge Caravan rattled slightly as it pushed through the icy roads somewhere in the middle of Michigan. The wind howled outside, and the snowflakes that fell in thick, relentless waves gave everything a surreal, dreamlike quality. By that time, I had been driving for hours, and my body was starting to protest. The cold, fatigue, and hunger were gnawing at me, and I knew I needed to stop. The thought of grabbing some hot food and taking a short break sounded more and more appealing. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 9 p.m. when I spotted a small rest stop up ahead. Through the swirling snow, I could make out the glowing signs of a gas station, a dingy-looking motel, and thankfully, a McDonald's. I decided to pull over. The parking lot was only partially plowed, and I had to be careful navigating my car into one of the few cleared spots. As I parked, I noticed about 10 or so other vehicles scattered around, most parked near the motel. I assumed their owners had decided to hunker down for the night because of the weather. When I stepped out of my car, the icy wind hit me like a brick wall. The cold was so sharp it felt like needles stabbing my face, and I immediately regretted leaving the warmth of the vehicle. But hunger drove me forward. My boots crunched loudly on the snow as I hurried toward the glowing McDonald's, the warm light spilling out from the windows offering a small comfort. Inside, it was cozy but eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the only sound besides that was the low hum of the heater in the corner. There was just one other patron, a man who looked to be in his mid-50s, sitting alone at a corner table with a coffee cup in hand. The place had an almost desolate feel, as if time had slowed down along with the snowstorm outside. I approached the counter and ordered a 10-piece chicken nugget meal with fries and a Sprite. As I waited for my food, I glanced up at the TV in the corner, which was showing a holiday special. For a brief moment, the warmth of the restaurant and the holiday spirit on the screen made me forget about the cold and isolation outside. When my food was ready, I grabbed the tray and took a seat near the window. The snow outside was falling heavier now, coating everything in a thick, unbroken layer of white. I ate quietly, savoring the warmth of the nuggets and fries. A few minutes later, The man from the corner table stood up and walked over to me. His approach startled me at first, but then he smiled warmly. "Hey, do you mind if I sit with you?" he asked. I hesitated for a second, unsure, but then nodded. "Sure, why not?" He introduced himself as Jeremy. He had a kind face, framed by white hair and a long white beard that immediately reminded me of Santa Claus. He even wore a festive holiday sweater, complete with reindeer and snowflakes. He explained that he worked as a mall Santa during the holidays, something he clearly took pride in. We started talking about Christmas traditions, our families, and the holiday season in general. I found out he had been doing the Santa gig for over a decade and loved seeing the joy it brought to children. His voice was warm and friendly, and despite being strangers, the conversation felt natural, like catching up with an old friend. For about 30 minutes, we talked and laughed. Jeremy shared stories about his time as a Marine in his younger years and how it had shaped him. I told him about my family and how I was excited to spend Christmas with them after being away for months. But then, everything changed in an instant. While Jeremy was telling me about a particularly funny interaction he'd had with a kid at the mall, the door to the McDonald's swung open. A blast of cold air rushed in, and I instinctively turned to look. A man stepped inside, dressed in a thick coat and a ski mask. At first I thought maybe he was just trying to keep warm. It was freezing outside, but something about his body language sent a chill down my spine. He didn't remove the mask, and his movements were stiff, almost calculated. Before I could process what was happening, the man pulled a gun from his coat. 2 deafening gunshots shattered the quiet of the restaurant, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Jeremy's face went pale, and without a word, he grabbed my arm and pulled me under the table. My tray of food clattered to the floor as we crouched there, trembling. "Stay close to me," Jeremy whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." The man in the ski mask shouted at the cashier, demanding she empty the register. She couldn't have been more than 19, and she was visibly shaking as she fumbled with the buttons. "Hurry up." The man barked, firing another shot into the ceiling. The sound made me flinch, and I pressed myself closer to the floor. Jeremy's eyes narrowed. "I can't just sit here," he muttered. "What are you doing?" I whispered harshly, panic rising in my voice. Jeremy didn't answer. He began to crawl out from under the table, moving with a quiet precision that reminded me of the stories he'd told about his time in the Marines. I wanted to stop him, to pull him back, but I was frozen in fear. The ski mask man was so focused on the cash register that he didn't notice Jeremy creeping closer. Just as the robber zipped up his bag of stolen cash, Jeremy lunged at him with incredible speed. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it, sending the gun flying across the floor. "Someone grab the gun," Jeremy shouted. A second cashier, who had been hiding behind the counter, dashed out and grabbed the weapon. At that moment, the front door opened again, and 5 burly men walked in. They looked like truckers, probably stopping for a late-night meal. Taking one look at the situation, they didn't hesitate. Within seconds, the truckers joined Jeremy, helping him subdue the masked man. They pinned him to the ground, holding him there as he struggled and cursed. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, and the masked man was arrested. It turned out he was wanted for a string of robberies in the area. After giving my statement to the police, I turned to Jeremy, who was standing calmly by the counter, sipping a coffee as if nothing had happened. "You're a hero," I said, my voice still shaky. He smiled modestly. "I'd just doing what I had to do." I left the McDonald's that night shaken but grateful. It's been over 15 years since that snowy evening, and I often wonder what happened to Jeremy. He was a stranger who became a hero in a moment of chaos, and I'll never forget his bravery. It happened just last Christmas, and it's something I'll never forget. I was 16 at the time, spending Christmas Eve at home with my sister Jenna. My mom had to work the night shift, so it was just the two of us in the house. We weren't too worried. We'd stayed home alone plenty of times before, and nothing unusual had ever happened. Outside, the snow had been falling gently all evening, covering the streets and rooftops in a white blanket. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of stillness that makes every little sound creaking floorboards. The wind against the windows seemed louder than it should. To keep ourselves entertained, Jenna and I ordered some pizza and played Monopoly for a couple of hours. We were laughing, joking, and trying to outsmart each other, but eventually the game got old. By 6 p.m., Jenna decided to head upstairs to her room. I stayed downstairs for a while, but boredom got the better of me, and I went to my room to play GTA V on my Xbox. The time slipped by without me realizing it. When I finally looked at the clock, it was 7:45 p.m. I decided to take a break and headed to the bathroom. That's when the night took a strange turn. As I was in the bathroom, I heard something. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of the front door closing. My heart skipped a beat. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. But the sound was too clear to ignore. I quickly finished up, washed my hands, and stepped out into the hallway. "Mom?" I called out, thinking maybe she'd come home early. Silence. I tried again, louder this time. "Jenna?" Her bedroom door creaked open, and she stuck her head out, earbuds dangling from her ears. She looked annoyed. "What?" she asked. My stomach sank. If Jenna had been in her room the whole time, who shut the door? Before I could say anything, we both heard its slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. Jenna's eyes widened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Without a word, I motioned for her to come into my room. She didn't argue. We slipped inside, and I locked the door behind us. "Turn everything off," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I switched off the Xbox, the TV, and the lights. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the snow outside. I went to my closet and grabbed the military-style pistol my grandfather had given me a couple of Christmases ago. It was more for show than anything else. I'd never actually fired it, but right then, it felt like my only line of defense. We crouched next to the bed, Jenna clinging to my arm. The footsteps grew louder, each creak of the stairs making my heart race faster. Whoever it was had reached the top of the stairs. The sound stopped for a moment, then resumed, this time heading toward Jenna's room. The door creaked open. I gripped the pistol tightly, every muscle in my body tense. Jenna was shaking, her breathing shallow and rapid. The footsteps moved again, this time coming toward my room. They stopped right outside the door. Silence. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Jenna was clutching my arm so tightly it hurt, but I didn't dare move. The person didn't try the doorknob. They just stood there. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence, like an invisible weight pressing against the door. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again. They moved away from the door, back down the hall, and then down the stairs. We stayed frozen in place for what must have been several minutes, too scared to move. Finally, we heard the front door close again. "Stay here," I whispered to Jenna. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go out there," she pleaded. "I have to check," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. I checked Jenna's room and the other rooms upstairs, but there was no sign of anyone. Slowly, I made my way downstairs, my heart pounding with every step. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Whoever had been in the house was gone. That's when I remembered the security cameras. A few weeks earlier, my mom had installed cameras in the living room, kitchen, and upstairs hallway. I rushed to her bedroom, grabbed her laptop, and pulled up the footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. The camera in the living room showed a figure entering the house. They were dressed in all black, their face obscured by a pale, emotionless mask, the kind of mask that makes your skin crawl just looking at it. The person had unlocked the door with a key. I rewound the footage, watching in horror as they stepped inside, shut the door, and paused. That's when I had called out for my mom. The masked figure stopped and looked up, as if they could hear me through the floor. They walked toward the stairs, moving slowly, almost deliberately. Then they went into Jenna's room, stayed for a moment, and walked out. But the worst part? The camera in the hallway caught them standing outside my bedroom door. They didn't move. For a full minute, they just stood there, completely still. Then, as if they suddenly noticed the camera, they turned their head and stared right into the lens. I'll never forget that moment. The figure tilted their head slightly, like they were mocking me, before turning and walking back down the stairs and out the door. Jenna and I called the police immediately. When they arrived, we showed them the footage. The officers recognized the figure. They told us the same person had broken into another house just a few days earlier. That time, the homeowner had been home and the masked intruder had attacked them. Thankfully, Jenna and I were unharmed, but the thought of what could have happened still haunts me. We didn't sleep at all that night. My mom came home early from work, and we all stayed up until the sun rose. Whoever that person was, I hope I never see them again. But if I do, I'll be ready to protect my family. It had been a week since the intruder first broke into our house on Christmas Eve. My mom, my sister Jenna, and I were still on edge, but we told ourselves it was a one-time thing. Mom upgraded the locks and double-checked the cameras. We thought that was the end of it. Surely no one would dare to try it again. But we were wrong, terribly wrong. It was late December, and snow had started to pile up outside, covering the neighborhood in a thick, quiet blanket. Mom and Jenna were leaving for a trip to Las Vegas, leaving me home alone. I didn't mind staying back. I wasn't much of a traveler, and to be honest, I was looking forward to a couple of lazy days to myself. Before leaving, Mom reminded me to lock all the doors and windows and keep my phone close in case anything happened. Before they left, I asked Mom if I could invite my friend David to stay over for a few nights. She said it was fine as long as we didn't throw a party or break anything. So, I texted David, and he said he'd be over in 5 minutes. As soon as he arrived, Mom and Jenna left, waving goodbye and reminding me one last time to stay safe. David and I decided to spend the evening watching basketball. He grabbed the remote and flipped through the channels while I ordered some food from Uber Eats. The Atlanta Hawks were playing the Indiana Pacers, and we were just getting into the game when the doorbell rang. I grabbed the McDonald's order, thanked the delivery driver, and wished them a happy new year. We dug into our food, laughing and talking about school, when my phone buzzed. I wiped my hands on a napkin and picked it up. It wasn't a call from Mom or Jenna, nor was it a notification from Uber Eats. The message was from an unknown number. Remember me? I frowned and showed David the text. Do you know this number? I asked. He shook his head. Who is this? Unknown. Remember me? Me. If you tell me who you are, maybe I'll remember you. There was a pause before the next message came through, and when it did, my heart nearly stopped. I'm the person who broke into your house. I froze. My hand tightened around my phone as I stared at the screen. David noticed my expression and stopped eating. What's going on? He asked. I told him about the intruder from Christmas Eve, the person in the white mask who had walked through my house like he owned it. David's face turned pale. That's weird, he said. A couple of days before Christmas, I saw someone wearing all black and a white mask near my neighbor's house. I thought it was just a prank, but now I'm not so sure. The eerie connection made my stomach churn. I decided to check the security footage again to see if anything unusual had been caught on camera. David followed me upstairs to my mom's room, where the laptop was kept. I opened it, but it asked for a password. I didn't want to bother Mom while she was on vacation, so I closed it in frustration. Then my phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "What are you doing upstairs?" Chills ran down my spine. My hands shook as I showed David the message. Before I could even process what was happening, David let out a scream. I turned to see what he was looking at and froze. Through the window we saw him, the same intruder. He was wearing all black, the same white ski mask covering his face. He was standing in the bushes, staring right at us. The snow around him looked trampled, as if he had been pacing there for a while. Before we could react, he bolted toward the backyard door. I could hear the crunching of snow as he sprinted, and then came the banging. He pounded on the glass door, harder and harder, like he was trying to break it down. Panic set in. I grabbed the .45 pistol my grandfather had given me for self-defense and ran downstairs. David followed close behind, his phone in hand, already dialing 911. When I reached the kitchen, I aimed the gun at the door. The intruder stopped banging and stared at me through the glass. For a moment, we locked eyes. Then, without warning, he turned and ran, stumbling through the snow before disappearing into the bushes. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the area around my house but found no sign of the intruder. When they noticed the security cameras, they asked if they could review the footage, but I had to explain that I didn't know the laptop's password. They suggested I stay somewhere safe until my mom came back from her trip. And David's parents were more than happy to let me crash at their place. That night, I explained everything to my mom over the phone. She was furious and promised to come home early. The next few days passed uneventfully. Mom and Jenna returned, and nothing strange has happened since. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. I've learned to stay on high alert, especially during the holidays. And to the intruder who terrorized my family, if you ever come back, you won't be as lucky next time. Hey everyone, I'm curious to know more about you all. Drop a comment below and let me know which country you're watching from. I love seeing how far our community reaches, so don't be shy. I'll be reading through the comments. The snow had been falling softly all morning, a quiet blanket of white covering Anchorage. It was the kind of cold that made the air sharp in your lungs and caused frost to gather on the edges of windows. For 7 years, this had been my home. Ted Stevens International Airport kept me busy most days, and I'd grown used to life here. But every now and then, I longed for something more familiar. Something like home. That's why last Christmas, I decided to take a break and drive up to Fairbanks to spend the holidays with my family. It had been months since I'd seen them, and the thought of a week away from work felt like a breath of fresh air. The drive from Anchorage to Fairbanks wasn't new to me, but anyone who's ever taken it knows just how quiet and lonely it gets. Once you leave the city, it's just you, the road, and miles of snow-covered wilderness. Trees heavy with snow line the way, mountains rise in the distance, and everything feels untouched, frozen in time. I had spent the morning taking care of last-minute chores before my trip, which meant I didn't leave Anchorage until around 2 p.m. By then, the sun was already starting to dip lower, casting long shadows over the snow. With me on this journey was my cat, Luna, a small bundle of black fur with a streak of white on her nose. She hated car rides, but she had been surprisingly calm that day, curled up in her carrier on the back seat. The temperature outside was brutal. It had been 5 degrees that morning, but as evening crept in, it had dropped to -15. By the time the sun was gone, it was closer to -20. Inside the car with the heater running, Luna and I were warm, but stepping outside for even a moment felt unthinkable. The drive was long, and the road stretched endlessly in front of me, surrounded by trees and fields covered in snow. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. It was peaceful, but also unsettling in a way. There's something about that kind of isolation that makes you hyper-aware of your surroundings. After a while, I felt the first signs of needing to use the restroom. I'd been sipping coffee from my thermos to keep myself awake, and it was catching up with me. Being a woman, stopping on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly ideal. I remembered how miserable it had been the last time I'd tried that during a drive to Seward. Luckily, about 10 miles ahead, I saw a sign for a rest area. Relieved, I decided to hold it until I got there. The rest stop was as simple as it gets a small cement building with one male and one female restroom. No other vehicles were parked nearby, which gave me a little comfort. I've always been cautious, and my mind tends to wander to the worst-case scenarios, probably from watching too many scary movies. As I pulled in, I left the car running for Luna's sake. She was still curled up in the back seat, and I didn't want her to get cold. Grabbing my 9mm Smith & Wesson from the glove compartment, I tucked it into my pocket. I wasn't paranoid, but being alone out here made me feel uneasy. The freezing air hit me like a wall as I stepped out of the car. My boots crunched against the snow as I hurried to the restroom. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, the sound echoing in the stillness. I paused for a moment, listening. Nothing. The restroom was as empty as the parking lot outside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Inside, the temperature was barely any better than outside, and the toilet seat was ice cold. I had to get creative, which I won't go into, but it was uncomfortable to say the least. I was just starting to relax when I heard the crunch of tires on snow. At first, I thought maybe I had forgotten to put the parking brake on and my car was rolling. But as the sound got closer, I realized it wasn't my car. Someone else had pulled into the lot. My heart immediately started racing. The sound of a car door opening and closing followed. My mind raced with possibilities. What were the odds that someone else would stop here, in the middle of nowhere, at the same time as me? I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone else needing a break. But still, the unease settled deep in my chest. I finished as quickly as I could and opened the restroom door, stepping out into the freezing night air. That's when I saw a truck parked right next to my car. Sitting in the passenger seat was a man, his face illuminated by the glow of his truck's headlights. He was smoking a cigarette, the orange ember glowing in the dark. As I walked toward my car, he opened his door and stepped out. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying over the snow. "Hello," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. My heart was pounding, and my breath came out in short, visible puffs. The man smiled, but there was something about it that put me on edge. He was big, easily over 6 feet and close to 300 pounds. I was 5'4" and barely over 115 pounds. The difference between us was impossible to ignore. "What's a cutie like you doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" he asked, taking a step closer. I forced a nervous laugh. "Just needed a restroom. My family's waiting for me, so I've got to get going." I took a step toward my car, but he moved to block my path. "No need to rush," he said, his tone shifting. "Your family can wait. Why don't you come sit in my truck for a bit? I promise it'll be fun." The smirk on his face sent a chill down my spine. My hand instinctively went to my back pocket, where my gun was. "Get out of the way," I said, my voice shaking but firm. The man didn't move. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his smirk widening. Before he could finish, I pulled out my handgun and pointed it at him. His expression changed instantly. "Huh, okay," he said, raising his hands. "Calm down. I was just joking around. No need to get so defensive." "And move," I said through clenched teeth. He hesitated for a moment before backing away. Without another word, he climbed into his truck and drove off, his tires kicking up snow as he sped out of the lot. I stood there for a moment, shaking. Luna's angry hissing snapped me out of it, and I quickly climbed into my car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were trembling so badly that it took me a moment to steady them on the steering wheel. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't stop glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his truck following me. By the time I finally reached Fairbanks just before midnight, I was exhausted physically and emotionally. After a long, hot shower and some much-needed sleep, I tried to push the encounter from my mind. But even now, I can still hear the crunch of his boots on the snow and the way his voice sounded when he said, "Your family can wait." It was Christmas Eve, 1997, and even after all these years, I still remember it like it just happened. I was 20 at the time, working the night shift at a drive-up convenience store in downtown Los Angeles. That was also the year I met my girlfriend, Megan, who's now my wife. But that night had nothing to do with love or Christmas cheer. That night was one of the scariest moments of my life. Southern California isn't known for snow, but that year it rained like it hadn't in nearly a decade. Streets were flooding, storm drains were overwhelmed, and the steady sound of rain on the pavement filled the air. It wasn't the kind of weather where you expected much business, so I figured it'd be a quiet shift. I was sitting at the counter, sipping on a warm cup of coffee, and enjoying a bagel while the radio played softly in the background. The rain kept coming down harder, drumming on the roof like a warning. I glanced out the foggy windows, trying to see through the downpour, when a man appeared. He came out of nowhere, walking slowly toward the store. He wore a black poncho with the hood pulled up, hiding his face. The dim lighting in the parking lot didn't help much either. It was always too dark around the store, something my boss had been too cheap to fix. I called out to him, trying to sound friendly. "Let me know if you need anything." He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. He just wandered around outside the store, pacing, and then disappeared around the back of the building. I couldn't see his face, and the way he moved sent a strange feeling through me. Still, I shrugged it off. It was late, the weather was terrible, and I figured he was just another random guy waiting for the rain to let up. The rain started coming down even harder, sheets of water cascading down the glass windows. A few minutes passed, and I was just starting to relax when I heard the deep rumble of an engine. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the drive-up lane. I set my coffee down and stood up, ready to greet the customer. I walked over to the counter, putting on my best customer service smile, but before I could say anything, the CUV's doors flew open, every door except the driver's side. That's when I saw them. 4 men jumped out, their faces hidden by ski masks. My heart dropped. They were all armed, each one gripping a handgun. "Put your hands up. Now!" One of them shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. I froze, the words barely registering in my head. My coffee mug tipped over behind me, spilling onto the counter. "Move it!" Another one barked, waving his gun toward the cash register. I raised my hands, my legs feeling like they were made of stone as I backed toward the register. My mind was racing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to me. But it was real too real. As I turned toward the register, I caught a glimpse of someone standing just inside the doorway. It was the man in the black poncho. The hood was still up, but now I could see the faint glint of metal in his hand. He had a gun too. He wasn't just some random guy. He'd been watching me, waiting. Empty the register. All of it. One of the masked men yelled. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, opening the drawer. We didn't keep much cash on hand, maybe $500 total, but I didn't think they'd care. They didn't look like the kind of guys you could reason with. As I stuffed the bills into a bag, I could hear them moving around the store. One of them was grabbing packs of beer from the fridge. Another was sweeping scratch-off lottery tickets into his jacket. I tried not to look at them, afraid that even glancing the wrong way might set them off. When the register was empty, I stepped back, holding the bag out to them. "This is all we've got," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One of them snatched it out of my hands. For a moment I thought it was over, but then the driver stepped out of the SUV. He didn't have a mask on. His face was clear as day, and his eyes locked onto mine. He walked right up to me, his boots splashing in the puddles of rainwater on the floor. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "If you tell anyone about this, if you even think about calling the cops, we'll come back. And next time, we won't leave you breathing." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Satisfied, he climbed back into the SUV. The others followed, slamming the doors shut. The engine roared to life, and just like that, they were gone, disappearing into the storm. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty parking lot. My mind was blank, my body frozen. Then the adrenaline hit me all at once. My hands started shaking uncontrollably, and my legs felt like they might give out. A few minutes later, headlights pulled into the lot. My heart stopped. I thought they'd come back to finish the job. But it wasn't them. It was just a man, wearing a security uniform, coming in to grab a Pepsi and some chips after his shift. He took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I must have looked pale as a ghost, still standing there like a statue. I stammered out what had happened, the words tumbling over each other. "Please," I begged him. "Just stay here with me until the cops get here." To his credit, he didn't hesitate. He stayed by my side until the police arrived. I filed a report, but I knew deep down they wouldn't catch them, and they never did. I quit the job a few days later. I couldn't go back there, not after what happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, or worse, I imagined them coming back. Now it's been over 20 years. I live in Salt Lake City with my wife, Megan, and our 3 kids. Life is good, but every Christmas Eve, I can't help but think about that night. The rain, the men in ski masks, and the driver's cold, piercing eyes. Some memories just don't fade, no matter how many years pass. I grew up out in the country, and I've always been a country boy, born and bred. There's something about it, the simplicity, the quiet, the long, drawn-out sunsets, and the wide-open fields that makes you feel like you're living in a different world. When I've had a few too many beers, I crank up some bluegrass on the radio and maybe smoke a little weed to wind down. It's a peaceful, laid-back way of life, and I wouldn't have it any other way. After I left my folks' place, I took a job working on a farm nearby. The owner of the farm, a guy named Josh, let me live in this small building out behind his farmhouse. It was secluded, set far off from the main house. The little building had no central heating, but it had water and electricity and a stove to cook food. During the bitter cold winters, I'd light that stove and huddle close to it, trying to stay warm, but I liked the quiet of it all, the solitude. It wasn't like I had a lot of people coming around. During the summer, some of my buddies would swing by to hang out, drink, and smoke a little. But come winter, most of them had better places to be, and it was just me, alone, with the wind howling outside. I liked it though, despite the loneliness. There was something peaceful about it. The farm was pretty quiet in the wintertime, especially on Christmas Eve. This particular Christmas Eve was colder than usual. Snow had started to fall in the afternoon, and the winds were picking up. The whole night had this eerie, still feeling to it, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. The family who owned the farm had gone off to visit relatives, and it was just Josh and me left behind. I'd seen him out doing some work earlier, but we didn't speak much. We never did. I didn't mind it, though. I was used to the silence. As I sat down to a simple Christmas dinner by myself in that small, cold building, I heard something that didn't belong: gunshots. It wasn't unusual to hear gunshots in the country, but this was different. It wasn't a couple of shots from the woods or a nearby farm. These shots were deliberate, too close for comfort. I didn't think much of it at first, just continued eating my meal. But when I heard a second shot, I felt a little uneasy. That came from Josh's place, I was sure of it. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Gunshots weren't uncommon around here. But then came the sound that made my stomach twist. A loud thud against my door. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a person's footsteps. No, this was different. Something had crashed into the door with force. I froze. Then it happened again. Another thud. And another. I could feel the vibrations of each thud through the floorboards beneath me. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, unsure of what was going on. I was a little scared, but I didn't want to admit it. I crept over to the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. The cold air in the room seemed to thicken, the pressure rising as I pulled the door open. The body that fell onto me wasn't what I expected. It was Josh, and he was in bad shape, blood covering him in patches, his clothes torn, and his eyes wide with fear. I pulled him inside quickly, panic setting in. I didn't know what to do. His breaths were shallow, his face pale as he mumbled something incoherent, clearly in shock. He had been shot, no question about it, but he couldn't explain what had happened. I knew I had to get help. I had to call an ambulance. But as I turned to rush out, my heart sank when I saw something I hadn't expected: a truck parked in front of the main house. I didn't recognize it. The front door was wide open. It didn't take a genius to figure out that something wasn't right. I froze. I could hear footsteps approaching the back of the house, muffled by the snow, but still too close for comfort. Then the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked, a click that made my blood run cold. I hadn't been seen, but I knew I had to move fast. I ducked around to the back of the house, praying I wasn't spotted. Luckily, the back door was unlocked, and I slipped inside, closing it silently behind me. With my phone shaking in my hand, I dialed 911 and whispered the situation to the dispatcher. I could hear muffled voices on the other side of the house, moving around, whispering urgently. The dispatcher promised to send police, but until then, I had to stay hidden. I locked every door I could, every window. It felt like the house itself was closing in around me. The stillness of the night was suffocating, and every creak of the house, every faint rustle of wind through the trees, seemed louder than it ever had before. As I waited, I could hear the sound of someone at the back door again. This time, much closer. They were testing the lock, trying to see if they could get in. My heart pounded, each beat reverberating in my chest as I pulled the pillow over my head to muffle my breathing. After a long, tense silence, the sound stopped. It was like whoever was out there had vanished, just melted into the night. I waited another 5 minutes, still not daring to move. Finally, I heard the familiar sound of sirens in the distance, a welcome relief. The police arrived, and I explained everything, my voice shaking with adrenaline. They didn't seem surprised when I told them about the truck, the man with the gun, or Josh's injuries. They found the truck parked out behind the house and arrested the man, though I didn't stick around to see what happened next. Josh eventually recovered, but it took time. I never found out what happened to the man who'd shot him, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that he wasn't just after Josh. Something about the whole night, about the gunshots and the strange noises, felt off. There was something dark lingering in the air that Christmas Eve. Even now, when I'm back on the farm or sitting alone in that small building, I can't shake the feeling that something or someone is still out there, watching, waiting. To this day, I don't know if it was just a random act of violence or something far worse, but I've learned to trust my gut, and something about that night still doesn't sit right with me. I can still hear the sounds of the wind howling, the crunch of snow beneath heavy boots, and the creaking of the door. And every Christmas, when the snow falls again, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been there. It was Christmas Eve of 2021, and my brother, Shadow, and I were both excited to finally be able to spend the holiday at home with our parents. I'm 31, and he's 22, and we live in a city about 2 hours away from our hometown. With both of us working as managers, it can be hard to take time off. But this year, we managed to work it out and leave early enough to be with our family. It wasn't just Christmas for us, it was also our mom's birthday, which falls on Christmas Day, so we've always celebrated it together on Christmas Eve. We got home around 5 p.m., and we started the evening with cake, presents, and the usual birthday celebration for Mom. It was just the four of us: Mom, Dad, Shadow, and me. It was a quiet, cozy time, and I was glad we could be there. Afterward, we decided to settle in and watch a Christmas movie to really get into the holiday spirit. Dad tends to fall asleep easily on the couch, so by the time we'd been watching for about 20 or 30 minutes, he had already started nodding off. Shadow and Mom were chatting on the other couch, and I was distracted by my phone, not paying much attention to anything else. But then, suddenly I heard a loud knock at the front door. It was nearly 9 p.m., and we weren't expecting anyone. The door had a window in it, but the glass was designed so that you could see light through it, but not clearly see who was outside. I was sitting directly across from it, and when I looked up, I saw a figure standing there. Immediately, my stomach sank. It was like my body knew something was wrong, even before my mind caught up. I felt a rush of fear, though I couldn't explain why. I reached out and lightly slapped Dad on the arm to wake him up. I told him someone was at the door. In a groggy state, he got up and opened the door, and I could tell something wasn't right from the moment I saw the man standing there. He was older, probably in his mid-60s, but there was something strange about him. He kept repeating the same thing over and over to my dad. "She's here. I need to see her. Sandra. Sandra has my medicine. I need it." Dad told him he had the wrong house, but the man didn't seem to care. He kept pushing, his words becoming more desperate. I felt my heart start to race. Something about the way he kept saying Sandra's name he wasn't leaving. I jumped up from the couch, Shadow and Mom following me to the door. All four of us stood there, telling him he had the wrong house. But then, suddenly, without warning, the man tried to force his way inside. It all happened so fast. He nearly knocked Dad over, and my dad is a big guy over 6 feet tall and well over 300 pounds. Yet somehow, this thin, scraggly man was able to catch him off guard. It felt like everything slowed down in that moment. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I watched Dad, Shadow, and Mom try to shove the man back. The door was still open, and he was pushing against it with all his might. He had his hand on the edge of the door, refusing to let go, even as Shadow started punching his hand repeatedly. I counted about 6 or 7 hard punches before the man finally let go, falling back in pain. That's when the door slammed shut, and Dad quickly locked the deadbolt. The man, now on the other side, immediately began pounding on the door. It felt like he was trying to break it down. His fists hit the wood so hard that I thought the door would crack under the pressure. He was still screaming, calling for Sandra, demanding that she come out. "Sandra, I know you're in there. Give me my medicine." His voice was frantic, almost crazed. I was shaking, but I knew I had to act fast. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling as I spoke to the dispatcher. Meanwhile, Mom rushed to find something to defend us. We didn't have any weapons, but she grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a large, sturdy rolling pin. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As she stood ready with the rolling pin, I couldn't stop glancing at the security camera pin pad, which showed the man pacing back and forth in front of our house. He would walk to the door, bang on it some more, then walk back to his car, and then return to bang again, all while screaming for Sandra. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, and then I realized something strange. As I watched him walk around, I saw him holding a bag that I didn't see when he first arrived. That was odd. Why would he have a bag now? Where did it come from? But before I could think too much about it, I rushed to my childhood bedroom, which was at the front of the house, to try and see if I could spot the man from there, while still on the phone with the dispatcher. Time seemed to drag on. The man had now been walking around the house for what felt like forever. He was getting more frantic, more desperate, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard sirens in the distance. Finally, the police were coming. It took about 15 minutes for them to arrive, and in that time, the man had walked around the entire front of the house. It was almost like he was trying to figure out how to break in. Thankfully, we had a privacy fence all the way around the house, which stopped him from trying to get in through the back. When the police pulled up, they parked behind the man's truck, which was still sitting in our driveway, One officer spoke to him near the front door while the other stood near the man's truck, making sure he didn't try to drive off. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught bits and pieces. The man kept talking about Sandra and his medicine, and the officers asked him why he was there. Finally, they walked him back to his truck, and as they did, we opened the door to talk to them. I joined my parents, and we explained everything: how he had tried to force his way in, how we had never heard of a Sandra before, and how scared we were. Dad told them they had lived here for over 10 years and never had any issues like this before. The police officer then stepped outside with Dad, and they started to piece things together. It turned out that Sandra was our next-door neighbor, someone who had moved in just a month before. The man was her ex-husband, and apparently they were still helping each other out with things, like picking up medication. The bag I had seen him holding contained his medicine, which he had apparently gotten from Sandra before coming back to our house to continue his yelling and banging on the door. The cops took down our information and assured us the man wouldn't be coming back, though they didn't seem to think he was much of a threat at the time. They let him go with a warning, but something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with me. The fact that he kept coming back, even after getting the medicine, was strange, and we never heard back from the police after that night. No follow-up, no explanation. Christmas Eve will never be the same for us, and I'm thankful Shadow and I came home early. If we hadn't been there, I don't know what could have happened. I know it sounds cliché, but it really does make you think about how important it is to check the door before you open it. Whether it's through the peephole, the doorbell camera, or just making sure you're safe before opening up. Don't ever take chances, especially not during the holidays. Stay safe. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. If you stuck around until the end, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. As always, I'm looking for more story ideas, so drop a comment below with any themes or experiences you'd like to hear next. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes open.
Christmas 2017 was meant to be the beginning of a fresh chapter in our lives. My husband and I recently settled into a peaceful suburban area. The home may not have been flawless, but it belonged to us. The cozy porch, roomy spaces, and the charming sound of creaky wooden floors made it feel like a fresh start, a place where we could create our dreams. After spending a long time unpacking and setting up my furniture, I finally treated myself to a warm cup of tea to help relax my tired muscles. The outside air had turned quite cold, and the warmth of the tea felt like a little treat. Holding my mug, I made the choice to check out the balcony above. When I walked out onto the balcony, the sight was stunning. The snow covered the rooftops, resembling frosting on a gingerbread house. Christmas lights twinkled brightly, their reflections shimmering in the icy spots on the ground beneath. A soft melody of carols floated gently in the air, far away yet soothing. After many weeks, I finally experienced a sense of calm. However, I found my focus drawn to the neighboring house. A man and a woman were standing on their balcony, their voices lifting above the stillness around them. The man waved his arms around, his face flushed with rage, while the woman yelled in response, her hands tightly balled into fists. Even though the words disappeared into the breeze, their intensity was clear. I paused, feeling uncertain about my next steps. I kept reminding myself that it wasn't my concern. The image of their anger stayed with me as I returned indoors. The following morning, the home felt cozy and welcoming, with the aroma of cinnamon candles wafting through the air. I wanted to create a warm and inviting atmosphere in the neighborhood, so I chose to host a Christmas Eve dinner. It appeared to be a nice opportunity to connect with the neighbors and kick off the holiday season in a joyful way. I created a list in my mind of things to do, like cooking, decorating, and naturally, searching for a Christmas tree. Our living room seemed empty without one, and I just couldn't picture celebrating without its sparkling lights. Later that day, I set out to discover the ideal tree. The snow made a satisfying crunch beneath my feet as I strolled through the neighborhood, taking in the beautiful decorations of wreaths and lights. As I walked by the neighbor's house, I heard it once more. The loud shouting, This time, the sounds were soft and unclear, coming from within. The woman's voice was quick and piercing, slicing through the air like pieces of glass. The man's voice came after, sounding more intense and filled with anger. I took my time walking, finding it hard to stop myself from listening in, even though I couldn't understand the words at all. A chill went down my spine, and I hurried my steps. At home again, the tree stood tall in the corner, its decorations sparkling in the gentle light of the string lights. The home really seemed joyful, as if the spirit of Christmas had genuinely come. With a strong desire to invite the couple living next door, I wrapped myself warmly and headed over to their home. The doorbell was out of order, so I gave it a knock instead. After quite some time, the man finally opened the door. His look surprised me. His hair was messy, and there were dark circles under his eyes. There was something off about the way he stood, almost like he was preparing for a confrontation. "I'm having a Christmas Eve dinner," I said, making an effort to sound happy. "You and your wife are absolutely invited to come along with us." "My wife is not here," he said straightforwardly. "I will go by myself." There was something in the way he spoke that caused a knot to form in my stomach. As he moved a bit, I noticed the floor behind him. A deep, shiny liquid, rich and smooth, flowed over the wooden floor. My breath was taken away. The man looked into my eyes, and his expression became serious. He didn't say anything else. He just closed the door with a bang and secured it with a lock. Christmas Eve came with a burst of excitement and hustle. The table was beautifully arranged. The candles were glowing softly, and the delightful aroma of roasted turkey wafted through the home. A lot of the neighbors showed up, sharing friendly smiles and tales about their experiences. However, the neighbor from next door didn't come by at all. I made an effort to set aside the discomfort that was sneaking into my mind, reminding myself that not everyone is outgoing. The sight of that dark liquid on his floor continued to linger in my mind. As the night came to a close and the visitors departed, I thought it would be good to see how he was doing one last time. The house next door was shrouded in darkness, its windows appearing empty and devoid of life. I tapped gently at first, then a bit more firmly, but there was no response. I shouted, my voice bouncing off the quiet, but the hush was overwhelming. The following morning, I got up early, feeling the chilly air biting at my skin. I snuggled into a cozy blanket, brewed some tea, and headed up to the balcony. This place had turned into my beloved spot, a peaceful haven where I could see the world come to life. While I looked at the neighbor's house, I noticed something interesting. The lower level was dim, just like it had been the previous night, but one room above shimmered softly. The light was soft, flickering as if the bulb might soon go out. And then I noticed it, a shadow shifting behind the curtains. A figure was visible, standing perfectly still for a brief moment before retreating into the shadows. My heart pounded heavily in my chest. Could it have been the man? Was his spouse back? I quickly made my way back inside, securing the door after me. That evening, I attempted to keep my mind occupied with a book beside the warm fireplace. The cozy glow of the fire barely eased my anxious feelings, and the quietness of the home seemed heavy and stifling. At 1:13 a.m., a sudden loud noise broke the quietness. I stood still, the book falling from my grasp. The loud noise happened once more, and it felt more pressing this time. My legs felt heavy as I slowly made my way to the door, glancing through the peephole. It was that person. The neighbor stood on my porch, his breath creating little clouds in the chilly air. He held a gun in his hand, the barrel shining softly in the light from the porch. I took a step back, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. As I dialed 911, I quietly shared my situation with the operator, each word feeling like a challenge. The man remained still. He simply remained in place, gazing at the door. As soon as the police got there, they quickly formed a circle around him. He went along quietly as they took the gun from his hands and put handcuffs on him. While they took him to the car, he shouted, "You killed my wife, and I will kill you next." The police arrested me as well, questioning me for hours about his accusations. Eventually, after the investigation, I was cleared and allowed to return home. The police walked into the house next door, their flashlights shining brightly in the dark. A little while later, one of them came out, looking very pale. They informed me later that her body was upstairs. She was suspended from the ceiling, her head oozing blood from where she had been hit. The pool of blood on the floor looked just like what I had seen a few days earlier. The man did not return. The police didn't share a lot of details about the investigation, and I felt hesitant to inquire further. I kept imagining her still body swaying softly from the ceiling in that softly lit space. For many weeks, the house next door stayed quiet and without light. Yet, there were moments, deep in the stillness of night, when I believed I could hear soft shouts drifting through the air. Sometimes, when I looked at their upstairs window, I thought I could see a faint shape of someone looking at me. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was 12 years old when it took place, and even though many years have gone by, I can still recall every detail as if it happened just yesterday. It was December, only a couple of weeks before Christmas. The air felt chilly, and snow blanketed the ground, softening noises and making everything appear still and strange. I was walking home from school, making little puffs of snow fly up with my boots. It was the best part of my day, that moment when I could roam around and think about anything I liked. That day, however, something seemed unusual. When I got to my street, I saw a man standing at the corner. He was not moving at all, just standing there and looking at me. His coat was long and dark, and he wore a hat pulled down low over his face. I took my time walking, not knowing what to do next. He didn't wave or smile, he just looked. I rushed the rest of the way home, feeling like his eyes were on me, which made the hairs on my neck stand up. I kept him a secret from everyone. Perhaps it was just something small, I wondered. It seems like adults are always standing around, right? The following day, while I was walking home once more, he was there. This time he was moving around. He began to walk behind me, staying close enough that I could feel his presence, but not so close that it felt uncomfortable. "Hey there, kid," he shouted. His voice was low and scratchy. I moved my head a little, but kept walking. "Are you looking forward to Christmas?" he asked. Sure," I said quietly, walking fast. "Do you know where to find the best Christmas tree?" he asked, sounding quite happy. I moved my head from side to side and didn't say anything. I didn't like how he said it, as if he knew something I didn't know. "In the forest beyond the old path," he went on. "That's where the really good ones are. You really ought to check it out yourself." When I got to my house, my heart was beating fast. I couldn't figure out why he was saying this to me. It felt odd, like a hidden thing I wasn't meant to find out. Some days went by, and I attempted to forget about the man. But each time I walked home, I had the feeling that someone was looking at me. I never saw him again, but the feeling remained. One afternoon, I was relaxing in the living room, enjoying some TV time. The light from the screen brightened the dark room while I rested on the couch. The phone rang, and I was startled a bit before picking it up. It was my buddy Mike. "Hey," he said, sounding excited. "Let's go look for a Christmas tree. The nice ones are up in the forest, you know." His words struck me hard. How did he find out about the woods? I didn't mention the man to him. "I'm not sure." I began to speak, but he interrupted me. "Let's go. It will be enjoyable." I talked to my mom, but she said no. "Your dad is going to bring home a tree," she said with certainty. "You're simply a child. You don't have to search for one." I sat by the window, looking at the snow coming down, waiting for her to go out. She finally said she had to go get my little sister from school and asked me to stay inside. I had a blend of feeling bad and feeling excited. Right after she left, I put on my coat and called Mike. Mike and I hurried out into the snow, giggling and gliding on smooth spots of ice. I shared with him the story of the man who had been keeping an eye on me and what he mentioned about the trees in the forest. Mike lifted his shoulders slightly. "We'll just take a look around," he said. Then he said, "I have to go to my friend's house first." His friend's house was at the edge of the woods, an old squeaky place that seemed like it hadn't been tidied up in a long time. Mike's friend was 18 and appeared a bit tough. He had messy hair and a constant frown on his face. The two of them began chatting quietly. At first I didn't really notice, but then I heard words like kidnapping and quick cash. My stomach felt all twisty. Were they just kidding around? Or even worse, were they being serious? I told Mike that it was getting late and that my mom would be back home soon. "I have to leave," I said, trying to sound relaxed. Mike chuckled and waved goodbye as I walked away. There was a quick path through the trees that would take me home more quickly. The way was slim and filled with big trees all around. The snow covered everything, making it quiet except for the sound of my boots crunching. I was in the middle of the forest when my shoe got loose. I got down on my knees to fix it, struggling with the damp shoelaces. That's when I heard it, a gentle crunching sound behind me. I stopped moving, my fingers resting on the shoelaces. Gently, I moved my head around. He was present. The guy from the corner was now dressed in dark clothes, and his face was hidden by a mask. My chest felt tight when he moved closer to me. I didn't think about it. I just went for a run. My boots slid on the snow, but I kept going. I could hear his steps coming up behind me, quicker and louder than my own. The trees became a fuzzy sight as I moved ahead, my breath coming out in quick, chilly puffs. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice bouncing around the trees. "Please come back, or something really bad will happen to you and your family." My eyes filled with tears, but I kept on running. The woods were becoming more shadowy, and I was unsure of my location now. My legs hurt, and my chest felt tight, but I just couldn't give up. I saw a big tree that had fallen, and its huge trunk was all covered in snow. I jumped behind it, pushing myself against the chilly tree trunk. My heart was beating hard, and I thought he could hear it. I paused and held my breath as I noticed his footsteps getting slower. He was near, very near. "Come out," he said, his voice loud and upset. "I'm serious." I tightly closed my eyes, hoping to disappear. After what seemed like a long time, the sound of his footsteps disappeared. I stayed quiet, counting to 100 before I felt brave enough to move. I walked carefully through the trees, looking for my way back. Every shadow seemed to like him, and every noise startled me. The snow was coming down more and more, and it was becoming tougher to see. Then I noticed a person in front of me, a shadowy shape. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Was it him once more? I started to run, but the person shouted my name. "Hold on, it's me." It was my neighbor, Mr. Harris. He had a job as a security guard and frequently walked around the area to keep it safe. I felt a huge sense of relief, and I hurried to him, tears flowing down my cheeks. He paid attention while I shared everything, and his expression became more serious. "Let's go," he said. "Let's take you back home." When I arrived home, my mom was there, upset and mad. But when she looked at my face, her anger changed to concern. I shared all the details with her, and she contacted the police. They looked through the woods, but didn't find anything. The man had left, and all that was left were his footprints in the snow. Christmas Eve had always been a big deal in our family. Every year, we hosted a dinner at my grandparents' house in San Diego. It wasn't a fancy place, but there was something about its worn-out carpet and the way the living room smelled like cinnamon that felt like home. That year, the house was lit up with colorful Christmas lights, the tree was piled high with presents, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey and baked ham. The night started like any other Christmas Eve. Relatives trickled in slowly, some carrying dishes, others just bringing themselves and their stories. Uncle Rick came with his famous green bean casserole, and Aunt Susan brought a pie that looked suspiciously store-bought. My cousin Jenna kept snapping pictures of everything and everyone, making sure to capture the perfect Instagram moment. The kids ran around the house, their laughter mixing with the faint hum of Christmas songs playing in the background. The dinner table was a sight to behold. Plates piled high with food, glasses filled with wine and soda, and candles flickering in the center. It was warm, loud, and full of life. Everyone was talking over each other, sharing jokes, and reminiscing about past Christmases. It felt perfect in its messy, chaotic way. Then there was him. I didn't catch his name when he arrived, and honestly, I wasn't even sure who had invited him. He looked out of place, sitting quietly at the end of the table. He was tall, with a pale complexion and thinning hair slicked back. His clothes were neat but oddly dated, like he had stepped out of an old photograph. He didn't eat much, just moved his food around on his plate and occasionally sipped from his glass. No one seemed to mind him, though. If anything, they acted like he had always been part of the family. It wasn't until dessert was being served that things started to feel off. Jenna, ever the photographer, wanted to take a group picture. She asked everyone to gather in the living room, and we all shuffled over, laughing and teasing each other as we tried to squeeze into the frame. The man hesitated, but followed us after a moment. When the camera's flash went off, he flinched like it had burned him. I remember him standing slightly apart from the group, his expression unreadable. The photo was odd. As Jenna looked at it on her phone, her smile faded. She turned the screen to me, and I immediately saw why. Everyone was there, smiling and happy, but the man looked blurred, almost like he had been moving when the picture was taken. The thing was, he hadn't moved. He had been perfectly still. Probably just a glitch, I said, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I wanted it to. We went back to the table for dessert. By now, the kids were winding down, their energy spent, and the adults were settling into a comfortable buzz from the wine. The man stayed quiet, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for something or someone. I tried not to stare, but something was unsettling about him. His presence felt heavy. It happened just as we were finishing dessert. The man suddenly stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. Everyone turned to look at him. He was shaking, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Then, without a word, he let out a scream, a raw, guttural sound that froze everyone in place. Before anyone could react, he bolted out the front door. For a moment, no one moved. We just sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Then Uncle Rick stood up, muttering something about going after him. A few others followed, grabbing their coats and flashlights. I stayed behind with the kids, who were now clinging to their parents, wide-eyed and scared. The minutes stretched on. I could hear the muffled sound of voices outside, calling the man's name, though no one seemed to know what it was. After what felt like an eternity, the search party came back, empty-handed. They had followed his tracks into the woods behind the house, but they just stopped. No sign of him, no footprints leading away, nothing. We called the police, of course. They came, asked questions, and searched the area, but there was no trace of the man. No one could even agree on what he had looked like. Some said he had brown hair, others swore it was black. One of my aunts insisted his eyes had been green, but I remembered them as gray. It was like he had been a different person to everyone who saw him. The rest of the night was tense. No one wanted to leave, but no one wanted to stay either. The laughter and warmth from earlier were gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. When we finally did go home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the woods. The next morning, Christmas Day felt hollow. We opened presents and tried to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. The man's absence hung over us like a shadow. The police called to say they had found no leads, and the case was closed. Just another missing person in a world full of them. Weeks passed, and life went on, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I started avoiding family gatherings, unable to face the questions and the unease. I even stopped going to my grandparents' house. It didn't feel like home anymore. A few months later, Jenna sent me a message. She had been going through her photos from that night and found something. It was another group picture taken earlier in the evening. In the corner of the frame, near the doorway, was the man. He wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, his eyes were fixed on me, his face twisted into a smile that sent a cold wave of dread through me. I deleted the message and blocked Jenna's number. I didn't want to know anymore.